Often when writing code, it'll be necessary to perform the same task multiple times in a row or in multiple places throughout the program. And it tends to lead to a temptation, especially for beginning programmers, to repeat the same structure of code, possibly with minor variations or maybe word for word, line for line, multiple times in the code. However, what you should start to develop is a sense that repeated code is probably bad practice, and there may be some structure that would help you to avoid repeating that code. Let's look at an example of needing to read in 5 integers from a user, which we can see I've set up here with a prompt to the user, 5 variables for the 5 integers, a prompt to ask for the individual integer, code to read that integer in, and then something to test if the integer is a multiple of 10. If the number mod 10 is equal to 0, that means there's no remainder when dividing by 10, and therefore it was a multiple of 10, and we should update our count here of the number of multiples of 10 that we've seen in the program. So one natural inclination would be to grab this chunk of code and to just recreate it multiple times to read in all 5 integers. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now you'll notice that the variable names need to be changed if I'm going to use those other variables I've set up, so that we're reading in the 3rd number, the 4th number, and the 5th number. This has a few impacts on our code. One, the code is more complex now than it was when we only had one number being read in, but sometimes that's natural. As we do more complicated things with code, the code will be more complicated. In this case, it's also a little more difficult to read because it's longer and the structure is just repeated over and over. The other thing that is very common in this kind of repetition and copying and pasting of code is that from time to time, a programmer will forget to update one of the places where they've copied and pasted if the variable name needs to change. So here we can see what we would do is we would read in the 4th number, and then we would not actually check that 4th number to see whether it was a multiple of 10. So this might take many executions of the program with many different inputs to find out where the error was in the program. So if we look at the structure of the problem in this case, we might see that while we are reading 5 numbers, we're doing the same test on each one, and we don't need to hold on to the original numbers. So instead, we could only use a single variable. Reducing the number of variables used can help to solve this kind of copy and paste error where we forgot to change the name of the variable in one of the places. It's not always possible based on the structure of the problem, but here it is. So now I've copied and pasted that section of code that reads in number 1, but it then reuses the variable for number 1 to read the 2nd number, the 3rd and 4th and 5th. This would correctly read in the 5 numbers, but as you can imagine, if I needed to read in 20 numbers or 100 numbers, it would make my code almost unbearable to read through. So that's one downside of this kind of direct repetition of code like this. It might be manageable in some cases, but another downside is that it makes my code harder to maintain. So if the user changed their needs, or if I realized there was a bug in what I had originally created for this, now I might have to change it in up to 5 places. For example, if the user says instead they need to be able to enter doubles, I have to change what's being reported in the prints and what's being read in, and possibly some of the math depending on the situation that I'm presented with. And I would have to change that in all 5 places. And so now again we run into that issue too, that I might forget to change it in one place and introduce an error that's very hard to detect because it only happens 1 out of the 5 times or 10 times or 100 times I've repeated that code. So rather than repeating the code, which again should give you a sense that something could be done better with the program, in this case I happen to know a structure that will solve the problem of needing to repeat the code. You may not always know a structure immediately that could solve the problem of repeated code, but it's worth looking into whether there's a way to repeat it, or to avoid repeating it, if you notice that there's structures of code being repeated over and over inside your program. Here I can use a loop. So I'm going to use a while loop, and we'll see why that's useful in this case in a minute. Often when I'm dealing with scanners, I find it's best to use a while loop, and I'll show you why. So here, I've set up the variable I and started it at 0, and I want it to go only 5 times, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then once it reaches 5, we'll want it to stop. Don't forget to add something to increment your loop variable, like this I++ down at the bottom here. So now when I is 0, it would enter this loop, and it would ask the user for an integer, and input that integer and test it, and update the count of multiples of 10 as needed. This gives us a few different benefits that the other repeated structures don't. One is, if we needed to read a different number of integers, we could just change the report of how many to read and the limit on I, and now we would be able to read in 7 integers, 100 integers, however many we needed to. Also, specifically with scanners, this while loop structure can be very beneficial if I wanted to read in all of the integers that a user might input and tell them enter any string, any word to quit. So now I've told them they'll be asked to enter many integers, and they can use any word as their input to quit. So I'll say, does the scanner have a next integer? And so long as it does have a next integer, it will enter into this loop. As soon as it doesn't, for instance, the user inputting a word or any other string that doesn't work as an integer, then the program should quit. So now I could read however many the user has for me without repeating that code some strange and variable number of times. Now I type done, and it tells me there were 2 multiples of 10 in the numbers that I entered. So what we should take away from this is we will often have to do repeated tasks or repeat similar behaviors throughout our code. There are many different good structures to help us do that. Copying and pasting or repeating the same structure of code many times is not one of those, because it makes the code more difficult to read. It may in fact make the code unbearably long in some cases, and it makes the code less adaptable. It's harder to do updates to the code if something needs to change about it, and it's harder to do things like accept however many integers that the user might have. And so it's best to find a structure that allows us to avoid repeating that code over and over.